So a few weeks ago, I got my very first Quilty box. I had never signed up for a subscription before, but the allure of a Tula Pink themed box this July really kind of got to me. So I signed up, and it came a couple weeks ago, and I opened it up, and it was full of amazing goodies, including this adorable fat quarter bundle that had 6 fat quarters of Tula Pink's new line, the True Colors. And they were all kind of the chartreusey, purple kind of colors that I really dig. So I wanted to come up with a project that uses these fabrics, and I thought that we should tackle improv curves. So all you need to do to prep for this is to cut your fat quarters into strips. I wanted my table runner to be about 18 inches wide, because that's the width of a fat quarter. So I cut my fat quarters into 5-inch by 18-inch long rectangles, just to make it super easy and to not waste any of this gray fabric. If you would prefer yours to be much wider, then you can cut your fabric the other way. You can cut it 21 inches by maybe 6, somewhere around there. That would use up the whole fat quarter and give you kind of a similar look. I'm using 5 fat quarters for my table runner. If you cut yours the other way, then you will probably need a few extra fat quarters just because you're getting kind of fewer rectangles out of each of your fat quarters. So your table runner won't be quite as long. The great thing about table runners is that if they're a little bit off, if they're not exactly the size that they need to be, they don't need to fit anybody. So as long as it lays on top of the table, it's okay, right? So let's get to it. So the process is you lay your first rectangle or the table runner in progress down, and you lay your next strip on top of it. So you need to overlap your rectangles as wide as you want your curve to be. So for example, this curve, I had to overlap about 2.5 inches, whereas this curve here, which is much flatter, I only had to overlap about 1 inch. Plus seam allowances, 1.5 inches. So I've overlapped mine about 2 inches here. So to make sure that you don't cut your curves kind of wider than your overlap is, you can take a ruler and just kind of slide it, and you can feel where that overlap in the fabric is. So that will just give you a guide. Now, both of these fabrics are right side up. Remember that. This is not a right sides together cutting. So you're going to take your rotary cutter, and you are just going to cut a gentle curve. You want to cut a curve that only bends in one direction, at least at first. Once you are a little bit more familiar with improv curves, you could do more of a wavy line, but to start, do just a gentle arc from side to side, or top to bottom. Now that we have our curve cut, we're going to remove the scraps. This is a scrap, and then if we move our ruler and kind of peel back this top layer, you'll have the scrap of the green. Now, don't those fit together perfectly? If only we could sew them just like that. That'd be great, right? Now that we have this lovely curve cut, it looks amazing, but we still need to sew it together. And improv curves, when you're cutting them, you're not taking into account any seam allowance. So it would be great if we had another 1/2 inch on the purple and 1/2 inch on the green, so that this ended up to be our seam line. But it's not going to, because we need to take 1/4 inch from both pieces for our seam allowance. So improv curve sewing does take a little bit more fussing, because you are easing in to curves that don't match up exactly. Like if you cut a drunkard's path curve and a drunkard's path kind of outer part, then those templates are designed so that the curves match up 1/4 inch in from the cutting line. But that's not what we've done here. We've just cut and they match up at the cut line instead of the sewing line. So you need to just take your time, use a lot of pins or glue-based or whatever you're comfortable with. I use a lot of pins, and just take your time. Sewing an improv curve is just like sewing a regular curve. The easiest way to do it is to keep the rounded piece on your mat and flip the kind of concave piece right sides together on top. And then what I like to do is I like to match up the highest point of the hill there. And I'm going to start pinning at that hill. I'm just going to put a pin right here. And now I'm going to pick it up, and I'm just going to gently walk this fabric around the curve, pinning as needed. I use a lot of pins right here because I'd rather pin here than fuss with it at my machine. If you would prefer to just kind of go for it and sew it together, then give it a whirl. I just kind of walk them down and match them up and put in a pin. And this is a great time to listen to an audiobook. I'm listening to this series called The Collapsing Empire right now by John Scalzi, and it's awesome. I love it. I'm a big sci-fi fan, and it's read by Will Beaton, which is like 12-year-old me crushing. Usually I take the time to starch my fabrics when I'm working with curves, but improv piecing is generally pretty forgiving, so I didn't bother this time. So because I did take the time to line up all my edges really carefully and pin them, I am going to use my seam guide just to make things a little bit easier. Done! So that curve is all sewn and pressed. I do press my seam allowances open even when I'm doing improv curves. I think that it just makes the seam line nice and flat. So you can obviously press to the side, and because there's no intersecting seams in this, like all the seams are vaguely parallel, they're curvy but parallel, you won't have to worry about really any buildup of bulk. So press to the side if you like. I'm going to keep going on mine until I use up all these rectangles that I cut from my fat quarters. We will be ready to make a little mini quilt sandwich and quilt this up. You can obviously quilt your quilt sandwich for your table runner however you desire. I chose to break out my walking foot and just do some gently kind of waving lines across the surface just to give it a little bit of visual interest and echo the piecing lines that we established with our improv curves. Now this ended up measuring about 50 inches long, so that means that each fat quarter that I used ended up getting me about 10 inches of length in my table runner. So you can use that to kind of give you a vague idea of how many fat quarters will yield you how long of a table runner that you're aiming for. So the next step is to trim all this excess batting and backing off, and then it will be just adding my binding, which I'm going to use this awesome kind of lime and purple binding that is from one of the Tula Pink lines, and I think it'll go really great with this kind of limey and purpley fabric that I used. Isn't this adorable? It's like a little Ferris wheel for your binding. I'll put a link in the description to this below. It has been super handy. I really actually enjoyed making my binding this time, and it'll just pull off as I'm attaching it to my project. Once I attach my binding, then this project is complete. I have a quickie pattern for this table runner in the description below. It is just one page, it's super easy, and it just kind of gives you the basics of the construction so you can reference it when you are away from the video. I'll be back with a new video on next week. In the meantime, I will put a link to another small project, kind of scrappy, that I did a few months back, a little set of improv quilt as you go coasters, and then there's also a link to the video that YouTube thinks that you will like best. So I will see you in just a little while. Have a fantastic week and happy quilting. My kids are inside. Convex. The humpy part